Hi, welcome to a new series here at Radical Bible on the Books of Kings, the original Game of Thrones. Long before Shakespeare made battling among kings popular entertainment in England, and long, of course, before the modern TV show of Game of Thrones made that kind of battling complete with nudity and much head cutting off, the Bible had its story long before that, highlighting the same kind of issues we face today. Battles for power, highlighting male virility as a theme, as you see in the very first verse, where it signals us that David could not get warm, indicating his male power has come to an end and it's time for successor. By the way, succession as well among popular shows that highlight some of these same issues. So before we enter into the first book of Kings, and I'm not sure I'm going to do the entire book, but since I did the entire story of David's rise in the books of Samuel, we have to at least get through the time of Solomon and the split in the monarchy in chapter 15. So we'll go at least that far, and then we'll see how we're doing when we get there. But to enter into it, we have to go over some of the major questions that scholars have been grappling with for the last 150 years or so, over how these stories fit with the text around them, in the cultural context, when they were written, etc. I'm not suggesting we're going to resolve those. Scholars still grapple with them, and to no clear solution, although there seems to be some consensus around some things, but it's at least helpful to know some of these things as we go. And I'll be referring to many of the things we discuss in this video as we continue, and as we look next video at questions and issues in interpreting 1 Kings 1 to 2, the first couple chapters of the immediate book we're in. So let's just jump right in. So you can see on the right side of the screen these themes we're going to go through, and the first one is, what is the relationship between these two books and other parts of the so-called Deuteronomic history, which goes from Deuteronomy through 2 Kings? And the immediate issue, of course, as I was just hinting at, is the story of David, as you see in the very first verse, continues, obviously, what we saw in 2 Samuel, which continues what we saw in 1 Samuel. Although if you watch my Samuel series, you'll know that the book of 2 Samuel ends with a set of 4 chapters in 21 to 24, whether you call them an appendix or something else, interfere with the flow of the succession and seem to refer to David's exploits just simply late in his career at an unspecified time. So the continuity between the two books is not as obvious as it might seem, and we'll go over that more when we look at the questions and issues in relation to these immediate chapters. But first we have to look at the bigger picture. And what the short answer is, and it's a very short answer in the scheme of things, is that most scholars would agree that at least some form of Deuteronomy and Joshua were written in roughly the 630s under the reign of King Josiah of Judah, who, according to the entire narrative of the books of Kings, is the greatest king of all time. Not David, but Josiah, whom you may never have heard of. And we'll get to Josiah. His story is reported in 2 Kings 22 and 23. Even if I don't do the entire books of Kings, I'll deal with that. So one of the issues is the story of Solomon, which the story world would be roughly in the 9th century BCE, or maybe even the 10th century BCE, depending on the chronology, which is a whole other issue we're not going to get into today. Then the question is it a witness to Solomon, or is it a theological reflection later, including possibly much later, like a couple of hundred years later? Something like myself today writing a story about the American Revolution as if I was writing it in real time, and not writing a history book, as obviously people do, including Ken Burns' recent TV series on the American Revolution, a play-by-play performance, but plainly a 21st century product, and obvious given it's a TV show. Whereas the Book of Kings is not so obvious of when it was written in relation to the events. So we just can't answer that specifically, but my argument I maintain the argument against many, I will confess that at least some of the Solomon story was contemporaneous at the time to justify why he was the successor. And it wouldn't make that much sense to have to provide all this detail, including all the murders and other elements that we'll explore, if this was just simply a memory from a couple hundred years later, unless it was trying to shape that memory in light of Josiah, which is a factor that we'll have to consider. The book of Judges itself is an amalgam from a number of sources, and many scholars would say some of the texts in it are the oldest biblical texts we have, and it certainly ends with the idea of what we really need as a monarchy. And so Judges seems to be from before the monarchy, or at least roughly contemporaneous with it, perhaps written to justify why Saul was made king in 1 Samuel 8. But we won't get in those details. And I've already gone over 1 and 2 Samuel in my Samuel video, so I won't go over all that now. But even this, what I've just said, doesn't completely answer the question, because we may find throughout, as we'll certainly see in chapter 2, the first verses of 1 Kings 2 are plainly from a later time. And so we'll have to explore as we go. Can we imagine that some of this is from the time of Solomon, discussing immediate circumstances, and some is reflecting much later? And the best we can do is say we'll look at that as we go. Number 2, what is the relation between the final version of 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, a later retelling of the monarchy story? 1st and 2nd Kings ends with the king in Jerusalem being held captive and the elite being taken off to Babylon. So it plainly ends with the exile, which is the end of monarchy. But it includes all the stories we looked at in 1st and 2nd Samuel of David and Bathsheba and various elements of violence that might make David not look good, quote unquote, depending on the criteria for looking good, to a later audience. But it's not just a matter of trying to make David and Solomon look better. It's a matter of what the focus is. If the focus of 1st and 2nd Kings is on the battle for power in Jerusalem, and after the first scene with the temple being built, it's hardly even an issue. So really, the battle of kings with their traditional enemies and opponents, as well as a relationship between Israel and Judah after the generation of Solomon when they split, are the main themes of 1st and 2nd Kings. Whereas 1st and 2nd Chronicles is primarily the theme in a post-exilic context of rebuilding the temple. That the whole point of the journey, starting with Genesis, which it begins with many genealogies, and going all the way up to Solomon, is to get the temple built, which is to try to justify rebuilding the temple after exile. So Chronicles leaves out much of the material, and I will not use Chronicles as any kind of factual basis to fill in, although many scholars do that. I will not do that because I'm not thinking don't think it's interested in facts as much as is in a story that provides a linear telling on the direction from creation to temple. So, internal coherence or lack thereof. And that partly relates to the question number 1 about what the relationship is between other books of when it was written, but there are other factors as well in terms of plot coherence. In other words, does one event make sense in light of the events that were narrated earlier? Or is there not coherence in terms of the plot? Even is there a plot? Is there just a sequence of stories, perhaps from a book of annals, which are referred to within it, the annals of the kings of Israel or the annals of the kings of Judah, for which there's no material evidence all these centuries later? So we'll have to look as we go at internal coherence, both in terms of ideology. Is it pro or anti-Solomon? Is it pro or anti-monarchy? Is it pro or anti-Israel? Are a number of the factors we'll have to look at. The process of composition overlaps what I was saying in number 1 about the relationship of the two books. But internally to the books of Kings, we're going to be looking more at, as I was just highlighting, the question of is some of it from the time of the succession, is some of it from the time of the split between the kingdoms, and perhaps then reflecting on the time of the succession, or the time of Josiah, I was indicating, or the time of exile. And so those questions, certainly the first 4 questions all overlap in terms of trying to explore what's behind the text on its surface to get at where it's from and what its approach is. And that leads us directly to this question of ideological stances of the book toward a whole series of things. And in my paradigm that I laid out in 2010 in my book, Come Out My People, God's Call Out of Empire in the Bible and Beyond, and now in 2026 in Creation or Empire, a much shorter version of that and what I did in Empire Baptized in the early centuries of Christianity, I highlight how the entire Deuteronomistic history is largely what I call a religion of empire story, justifying domination over, focusing on kings, justifying violence, and certainly being patriarchal in its treatment of women, and being elitist in its treatment of ordinary people, all criteria in what I call the religion of empire. And that would imply that the ideological stance is in favor of monarchy and in favor of the kings. But it's not always that consistent. It may well be that just like today, when many people favor the United States or say favor the global empire of economics, etc., they can still be critical of Netanyahu or of Trump or of Putin or of others, depending upon your own ideological stance. So one could support the overall idea of monarchy and not like Solomon, like the Josiah people suggest, for example. And so we'll have to see how the ideology plays out in various ways. Certainly monarchy overall starts off as a problem. It starts off in 1 Samuel, as we saw, as betrayal of Yahweh being king over them. That's not recalled here in 1 Kings, though. In 1 Kings, Solomon will be made king with the hope that Yahweh approves, but Yahweh's not directly involved in it. So there's already some question of, is this a betrayal of Yahweh, at least for readers who've been reading 1 Kings in light of what we saw in 1 Samuel 8 and what followed. So even there's some ambiguity about monarchy, especially in light of the end of 2 Kings, that monarchy collapsed. And so in light of its collapse, certainly people could look back and say maybe monarchy was a bad idea in the first place. But from the time of Josiah, it wouldn't be against monarchy, it might be just against Solomon, as we see in Roman historians like in Suetonius' 12 Caesars, dissing the memory of all the emperors before the one that he worked for, so that Romans wouldn't be nostalgic for, I wish we had Nero again or Caligula again, and certainly many people might have wished we had David again, according to the narratives. So there's some element of that in relation to Solomon from a Josiah standpoint. But where exactly is it? What exactly about the reign of Solomon does Josiah not like, and what parts is Josiah like? We'll have to explore as we go. The Jerusalem-centered monarchy question relates to an alternative-centered monarchy, i.e. in the north, in Israel, which takes place right after this one generation, when Solomon's apparently only son, Rehoboam, cannot hold it together, and Jeroboam rebels and establishes a separate monarchy in Israel, putting two symbols of God at the opposite ends, one in the north in the town of Dan and one in the south in the town of Bethel, but without a specific centered temple. And so there's some question of the relationship there. And we'll see throughout the books of Kings that the so-called sin of Jeroboam, which is precisely leading people away from Jerusalem-centered worship of Yahweh, is repeated 24 times as the sin of kings of Israel. In other words, they're sinners in the way that the Catholic Church might look at Protestants for not being Catholic, in this case for not being Judahites. So even though they worship the same God, Yahweh, and worship Yahweh in perhaps very similar ways, it's not in the Jerusalem temple, and that's deemed by these authors a sin. And so one of the issues there is, what can we make of the perspective of Israel, given this is a Judah-centered story? The reign of David, well, we've looked at David already, and we'll look at David a little more in these couple of chapters, and I'll offer some reflections on that. But I also offered some at the end of the story of 2 Samuel, where the authors of the Samuel story might well have been changing their tune in light of the end of it. The reign of Solomon, well, I'll just let that be for now. I've already hinted at it, but we'll look at that more at the next video when we look at the introduction of these chapters. The reign of Jeroboam, who some might see as a hero, but certainly the authors, the Jerusalem-centered authors, see as the greatest traitor of all, leading people away, much like many Catholics might have seen someone like Luther. Martin Luther, not Lex Luthor, Superman's opponent. The reign of Josiah, and his reign is often treated as if it's a reform. Some Bibles even have the beginning of 2 Kings 23 highlighted, Josiah's reform. But that reform consists of the slaughter of priests who were worshiping in the wrong places, worshiping Yahweh, but in the wrong places, getting death for that. I wouldn't call that reform, I'd call that slaughter, but you can decide for yourself when we get there. And what's it stand toward? Other kings. There are obviously many, many other kings throughout, both in Jerusalem and in Judah. Some are obviously understood as bad, like Ahab and his foreign Sidonian wife Jezebel, whose name still bears a pejorative ring for a certain kind of woman, at least in some circles, sexist as that might be. And then prophets. There are royal prophets, as David had Nathan as his royal prophet, and Isaiah is a royal prophet to Hezekiah, and Jeremiah is a royal prophet to the later kings, sort of. Isaiah is clearly a house prophet. Jeremiah refuses to be controlled by the kings, but he's in conversation with kings. But then there are non-royal prophets like Elijah and Elisha, who are a terror to kings precisely like Ahab, who I just mentioned, who are just out there in the wilderness, seeming that their Yahweh-given call is to be troublers of the king, at least that's the view of Ahab. So a lot of varied ideological stances, and as I've been highlighting throughout, one of the beauties of the Hebrew Bible is, unlike later Christianity, it revels in ambiguity. It does not have a need to have answers or single-voiced solutions to ideology or history, but to let readers revel in the ambiguity of it all. Which leads us to the intended narrative. And we have to note that depending upon when we think it was written, literacy was a very limited skill and technology at the time, both the skill of writing, but the technology of producing ink and quills and the kind of paper that's needed at the time from various organic materials, and not so much paper, but scrolls, of course. And so it would be very expensive and time-consuming. Who was it for? Was it just for the elites amongst themselves? In other words, is the whole story of the succession a wink-wink to people who really know the story? That's the report of the fictional version in the King David report by Stefan Hayem, who was an East German dissident during the time of the Soviet Union and imagined himself in the role of someone assigned by Solomon to tell the story, but wanted to stay alive by not telling too much of the true story that would get him in trouble with his employer. And perhaps there were similar elements here of whoever was employed by the kings to tell the stories at whatever time had to write within the lines if they wanted to save their own lives. Was it just for them amongst themselves, as literature was for most of history until recently? After all, Shakespeare wasn't writing so people could read his plays, but so they could watch his plays. Were there ordinary folks in and around Jerusalem? We certainly see in a post-exilic story in the book of Ezra, Ezra the priest scribe gathering the people to hear read aloud to them the book that's supposedly Deuteronomy, not supposedly according to Ezra, but according to modern scholars. And so they listened to it. Are there other reports of scripture being read to people? Well, not in these books. So we really don't know what ordinary folks thought about their kings and what the justification for them was or not, or whether these were just stories for the elite. Were they for the people of Yahweh beyond Jerusalem and Judah, of whom there were over time many? And certainly by the time of Jeremiah, there's a whole community in Egypt at Elephantine, and they were there for hundreds of years. And certainly not necessarily so far away, but just beyond Jerusalem and Judah in what we would call Israel, or the tribal areas to the north. So is it written for them? Would they know these stories or not? What about the foreign kings, many of whom are named, like Hiram of Tyre, who's named right away in our early chapters, or Pharaoh, who's implicated right away when his daughter becomes the first apparent queen for Solomon in 1 Kings 3? And what about for later audiences during the exile? If we take the view of many scholars that this was all written hundreds of years after the fact, then why all the detail? Why all the detail of names, as I was naming in the story of David as well, all these details that really don't mean anything to people later? Why not just the broad strokes that we see in the later in the book of Kings, where there's just King so-and-so reigned for a period of years and fought wars, and then they died and their son took their place, and there's not much story at all, just the chronological note like a book of annals. So why this detailed story about something way in the past, if it is in the past? We'll have to look at that more as we go too. Turning a little more theologically, what is the relationship between divine and human intentions and actions throughout the narrative? Because we saw in 2 Samuel 7 that Yahweh seemed through Nathan the prophet to promise that one of David's sons would be on the throne forever. But as we hear it repeated in 1 Kings, it seems to be conditional from a Deuteronomistic perspective that if you, Solomon, and your successors follow all the statutes and laws, then there will be prosperity under your reign. But if you don't, there will not be. In the end, Solomon is judged harshly for leading the people astray via the gods worshipped by his foreign wives. There we are, blaming the women again, in obviously patriarchal sexist fashion. But there's a tension between the divine and human intentions throughout. And it's what many scholars refer to as dual causation without trying to be able to separate them. That humans have free will but exist within the divine overarching control of the universe. And so what the relation between what God wills and what God does and what humans will and do is something we'll have to explore. Only a couple more and then we're done, at least with the initial view of things. At any given point in the story, what is the role of foreign monarchies or empires such as Egypt, Assyria, and Babylon? And sometimes those are plainly named. Plainly, Assyria conquers Israel in the north in roughly 722 and takes the elite captive, and we see the story there in 2 Samuel 17. And plainly, the Babylonians do the same thing in Judah 140 years later in 586. But there are also many other kings and monarchies, and Egypt is a player throughout. And it's one of the questions we'll have to look at right away. What is going on once Solomon's first wife in his harem of what will be 1,000 women is the daughter of the Pharaoh? Certainly there's some relationship with Egypt already going on that's not being named in the story that's worth looking in the background. And archaeology and other sources will give us some implication, some evidence rather, to imply what the story was about Egypt at the time. And then finally, how are the relationships between the people of Jerusalem and Judah and the indigenous peoples of Canaan portrayed? Plainly, in a text like Deuteronomy 7, it's all one way. The people are seen as what we might call a virus and need to be destroyed. As Yahweh says through Moses in Deuteronomy 17, if you don't destroy them, I will destroy you. But is that the view all the way through? Plainly, there are Edomites and other Canaanites in the land throughout, and they seem to be living there peacefully, as the book of Joshua admits that not all the peoples of the land were destroyed or cleared away, as Deuteronomy says God would do. So they're there. And what is the relationship with these people that, according to the Deuteronomic perspective, ought not to be in this land? And that has everything to do with how these stories are read today in light of Israeli and Palestinian conflicts over the land. Given that I just recently saw the U.S. ambassador to Israel said, no problem biblically if Israel takes all of the Middle East. They're justified by the Bible in doing that. Well, that's one view, but we may see some other views as we go. So that's a lot of material to be looking at just to begin our books, but next time we'll look a little more closely at the questions and issues in interpreting 1 Kings 1 to 2 as we enter into the larger picture of the Solomon narrative. See you for that next time. Bye-bye.